So PBIS data collection and analysis is our topic for today. So what is data? This is a term that we hear all the time. Data include the many sources of information that we use to make decisions about how to allocate our resources of time and attention for teaching, redirecting, prompting, and reinforcing those appropriate behaviors that we would like to see in our classrooms. So let's take a minute to look at the different data sources that we do have access to. The first one is office discipline referrals, or those write-ups of the inappropriate behaviors that we tend to see in our school setting. Detentions and suspensions is the next form of data. We realize that a lot of times elementary schools do not readily hand out detentions and/or suspensions nearly as often, but this does come into play in the middle school and high school setting. The next would be attendance and tardy records. How many times is that student missing school? How many times are they coming in late? Is there a pattern behind those tardies? And how is it making an impact in their academics? The next is minors tracking sheet. We typically use office discipline referrals to track those major behaviors, but how are we going to track those minor disruptive behaviors that are oftentimes teacher-managed behaviors in our classrooms? Grades. We know that grades and behavior go hand in hand. How are those grades, or how are their behaviors impacting their grades? Surveys. Surveys are pretty vague because it can include any survey that you provide your students to gain information and gain data for behaviors. Nurse and counselor visits. I think this is one area that is sometimes overlooked, but a lot of times students who frequently visit the nurse and/or counselor can provide a lot of insight into behaviors. Once again, is there a pattern? Are they always going down during math class, or are they going down during reading because they have a hard time with reading? And then finally, observation. So what exactly are we seeing in our classroom settings? Remember that data must be documented and shared to be most effective. So what is documentation? It is the material that provides official information or evidence, but it can also serve as a record. And we'll share a couple of different ideas and recommendations with you. The first on the left-hand side is the ABC chart. Let's take just one moment to reflect back on ABCs and what those mean. The A stands for antecedent, what happens before the behavior happens. It might be a task demand. It might be, we're done with recess and we have to clean up. The B stands for behavior, what the student does. Anything is included as behavior. And then finally, the consequence is the C, and that is our reaction to the behavior of the student. A lot of times tracking the ABC data can help us figure out the hardest question in behavior, the why behind behavior. Without figuring out the why behind behavior, a lot of times our interventions are going to not be as meaningful. On the right-hand side, we also have just a simple chart that you can use to track both out of seat and calling out behaviors throughout those different time frames. We can also use this to see if there is an uptick of either one of those behaviors during a specific time of the day. So why documentation? It helps support recommendations when you are presenting information to either administration and/or parents. A lot of times we might say to admin, I'm having a really hard time with this student, he is being non-compliant, but then we're not giving any data to back what we're saying. So it's really great to have this information readily available so that we know how to best help you and admin know how to best support that student in your classroom setting. It also helps with consistency among different classrooms. All students, no matter what grade they're in, should be at least attending specials classes, meaning gym, library, technology. And this is really great too, because those teachers will now have an ability to track behaviors just like we're doing in a classroom setting. And then finally, you can use a checklist to track behaviors easily. The bottom left-hand side, we have an example of basic event recording. This allows us to track the frequency of targeted behavior, meaning how many times is that behavior happening during a designated time frame. It allows us the ability to jot down the date, the time frame that you establish. You can tally how many times that behavior is happening during that time frame. And then on the right-hand side, you have the area to write the total number of tally marks that you acquired. On the right-hand side, we have an example of a completed frequency form. So just take a minute to look at that. It includes January 5th was the date. They did 1 hour timeframes. They have the simple tally, and then of course the total of how many times that behavior happened during those timeframes. Once again, this helps provide support and solid concrete information when you are presenting problem behavior to either parents or admin. There are two different types of data that we look at in regards to PBIS. The first is called outcome data. Is the plan resulting in progress toward our goals? Is what we want to happen happening? The second type of data is fidelity data. A lot of times the fidelity data looks at, are we implementing the systems and strategies that we agreed upon? Are we doing what we said we would do the way that it's meant to be done? Many times we don't reach the outcomes that we would like, and we oftentimes wonder why. But when we go back to look at the fidelity, are we implementing with fidelity? Sometimes we are, and it's just not working, but other times we're not implementing with fidelity. And when we're not implementing with fidelity, we're less likely to reach our outcome that we were striving for in the first place. So we want to make sure that we have both types of data being implemented. So why use data for decision making? Data really does help us ask the right questions, but keep in mind that it does not provide the answers. And many times we wish that it would. So we use data to do the following: identify problems. Where do we see an uptick of behaviors? Where should we focus our efforts? Maybe we're seeing more behavior in the hallway during transitions in middle school. Maybe we're seeing more problem behaviors out at recess. Maybe we have to focus a little bit more in those areas where we're seeing those behaviors increase. The next is refining problems. So we know what our problem is. Now we have to come up with a goal. How do we want to improve these behaviors and decrease the inappropriate behaviors? How are we going to achieve it and make that happen? What can we put in place to be able to make that work? Next, we can define questions that lead to the solution. Will it provide the outcome we want? Our interventions should help us meet our goal and that outcome that we set aside. It helps us look at problems more objectively. And then finally, we want to celebrate those successes too. And we say the same thing with positive behavior in our classrooms. Celebrate those successes. Let's celebrate the successes that we see among our data as well. So data helps place the problem in the context or location rather than in the students themselves. There are two foundational elements of data-based decisions. The first is decision-focused data systems. This allows us to assess the PBIS implementation fidelity through surveys. This is also mainstreamed primarily through PBIS assessment. The first survey is the self-assessment survey. This really gives us the perception of implementation of PBIS at your sites. We also have two fidelity checks, the first one being the tiered fidelity inventory, and the second being the benchmarks of quality. They are different, but they're very similar in the aspect of checking for fidelity of implementation of PBIS. The decision-focused data system also includes that discipline data system that we do have in place. Typically, it includes those office discipline referrals. Once again, those write-ups of the inappropriate behaviors that we're seeing in our school settings. And then the second foundational element is our team-based decision process. Analyzing that data among our teammates for the trends and patterns of behavior that we are seeing. I'm going to ask you to take just a minute and reflect on your current data and data systems. Are your data systems for each source effective and efficient? Meaning, can you take 60 seconds or less to fill out the office discipline referral or any other type of data that you're collecting? And does it take less than 30 seconds to enter it into some type of system for you to track that data in one area? And also, are you collecting the right information? We want to look at the big 5 WHs. The what? What is happening in our school? What problem behavior is happening? The where? Is it happening in the hallway? Is it happening on the playground, in the classroom, the cafeteria? We want to take a look at the when. What time of day? Or what day of the week? It could be the who is involved. Is it a specific grade level? Is it a specific gender? And then finally, that why. Why are these behaviors happening? What is maintaining those behaviors? Sometimes that's the hardest question to be able to answer. Once we make sure that we have effective data systems in place, it's really important to share out data with staff, students, and the community. There are a couple of questions that you should consider when you're sharing out data. We want to make sure that we're also sharing out data after our monthly PBIS data meetings. The first question to consider is, how are we progressing toward our goal? Are we meeting our goal? Are we going to meet our goal? Are we far away from meeting our goal? Do we need to make adjustments to our systems that we have in place or our interventions? The next question is, what are the results of our fidelity checks for our interventions? Are we implementing the way that we are supposed to be implementing these interventions? And then, of course, are these data accurate? Are we collecting data in an accurate way? And is it really depicting how we're implementing these interventions? The next question is really important as well. Are we overwriting or underwriting office discipline referrals? I've seen this happen where we've seen teachers who will write up behaviors very often, sometimes too much so. And then we have, on the other hand, the teachers who pretend to be superheroes at all times and never want to write a student up because they want to handle all behaviors in their classroom setting. The last question, are we being consistent in writing and definitions of behavior? We want to make sure that we're all on the same page, district or school-wide, so that we all know how to appropriately address these behaviors. It's also important to get a lot of feedback from your staff. It helps with staff buy-in and makes them feel valued and like they're a part of the PBIS implementation. And finally, it's really important to stress to staff the importance of accurate and consistent input. Once again, that consistency piece is huge in managing problematic behavior. So whenever we're drilling down our data, it's really important to come up with a precise problem statement based on the who, what, where, when, and why. It is very, very specific. Here is a perfect example to share with you. In September, there were a group of 10 4th and 5th grade students referred for minor defiance in the classroom during the morning classroom period, which happened to be from 8 to 9:30, in order to avoid tasks. So now that I know exactly what the problem at hand is, now I can come up with a goal. What am I going to do about this problem? How am I going to solve this problem? So the goal statement that this team has come up with is, by the end of November, the team would like to see less than 5 referrals per month from 4th and 5th graders in the classroom before first recess, which is happening at 9:30. So now we have our precise problem statement. We now have our goal. Let's move on to, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to meet that goal to decrease that problem behavior? So we have an area where there's a solution development. On the left-hand side, we have our solution components, including the prevention. How are we preventing that behavior as much as we possibly can in the first place? How are we teaching appropriate skills? Recognizing, extinction, meaning getting rid of the behavior as much as possible, and then corrective consequence. Let's correct those behaviors. Up at the top, we have our action steps. What steps do we need to take in order to implement these solutions? Who is going to be responsible for completing these action steps? When do we expect them to be completed? How are we measuring the fidelity of that solution? And then any other notes that we may feel would be beneficial. At the very bottom, this is key because it talks about our data collection. What data are we going to look at? They included Swiss data. Not all of you use Swiss, and that's okay. But have something that works for you and your site. Who is responsible for gathering the data? How often are we going to be gathering this data and looking at that data? When and how are we going to share this data with everyone else? And who's going to have access to that data? We want to keep data as confidential as possible and make sure that we're only sharing it with the staff members who need to have access to that data. And at this point in time, I'm going to hand this over to Brandy to finish us up.
All right. Hi, everybody. So I am now going to talk to you about tiers and the tiers of database decision making. So ways that you can incorporate some of this data into each of those tiers. And, moving on to the next slide, sorry, Allison's going to have to do this for me, but the goal of tier 1 data is to really review our school level data to monitor the impact of our universal practices that are on students. And remember, tier 1 is going to be effective for 80% or more of our students, but at least 80% of our students. But during these meetings, we really need to dive into the specifics other than students. And what we often see is when we go into these meetings, specific students get brought up, those ones that are kind of like skewing our data. They've got a plethora of ODRs. And while that information is very important, typically we like to reserve those conversations for tier 2 in our advanced tier meetings. So during these tier 1 meetings, we should be looking at specific data like location, times of day, grade levels, maybe gender, day of the week, perceived motivation, and problem behavior. And those are really those red flags that are popping up. Maybe you're seeing an influx of referrals in the bathroom. So that bathroom might be an area that we're really focusing on, and we're using that data to make adjustments as needed. And really, maybe we're seeing something like the grade level. A certain grade level has an influx of referrals. So we're referring back to that document that Allison just shared. We have a precise problem statement or an area that we want to focus on. And now our goal is to come up with a solution in order to decrease the amount of office discipline referrals that are occurring in whichever one of those is kind of popping up. The last thing here is the, you guys all will eventually, if you haven't yet, complete the tiered fidelity inventory. And that really helps to determine the effectiveness of our PBIS program. And that's going to really help make sure that all of our practices are being done with fidelity. One thing that we learned, our implementers forum was just last week, and this school in particular, Valley View Intermediate School in Archbold, Pennsylvania, they shared a wonderful tool that we thought we wanted to share with you for data collection. Now, this is something that may be used in replace of, just a paper form or using, Swiss to document those classroom managed behaviors. This is not something that would be used as your major behaviors, but this program right here, and we have it linked at the end of our presentation, is called Live School. And it is very familiar to Class Dojo, if you've heard of that before, and I'm sure most of you have, but it takes it to the next step. So how this is, and we're seeing here kind of a view of one student named Albert, and each student has a page and specific locations. You'll see hallway, lunch, and recess here. And each of those hands to self, single file, voice level are all of those kind of rules and expectations that live within that matrix. When a teacher or anybody really in the school sees a specific student demonstrating an appropriate behavior, they would then be able to reward that student with a point in respect to which that is. So it kind of elaborates on that behavior specific praise. They're telling that student, especially this one, I love the way that you cleaned up that table in lunch. He earns a point in that. And then you'll see when we are able to look at the information, I believe on the next slide, that we take all of these points, and each student is able to take their points and use it at a school store. So these students are really introduced to financial literacy. They're taught how to save money and get that stronger understanding of delayed gratification. This definitely wouldn't be, or you could, but I wouldn't recommend using this in place as your big ticket that you're giving out. However, I could see this being used in conjunction with it. Those of you who are looking for maybe a secondary ticket system, right? So you have your big ticket, your gold ticket that you're giving out for those big behaviors, and then you might use something like this for your teachers to, reward students and give them these points that they're able to use in the school store. And on the next slide here, they even it has the ability to give students like a little digital, debit card here that tells them their point balance. These are things that can be sent home. They can even print out like a little check, and they're able to see how many points they have. And they're even able to save those, roll them over, save them for next year. So it's a really nice way for students to kind of keep tally of all of those good things. It's just an extra dose of that behavior specific praise. Another thing that you can do is drill down a little bit more and see where you are seeing a lot of success for your students. So in this case, in general, engaged in class is one that they're sending out a lot, staying on task. And you'll also notice the demerits. I haven't mentioned that yet, but instead of filling out a classroom managed referral form, they give students demerits. Okay, so it's not taking away the points that they've earned, it's just tallying up how many times a student has had a misbehavior. Now, obviously, you would want to communicate with that with students and tell them, what they did wrong, but it's slightly different than Class Dojo, where when you take a point away, it takes it from their total. But this information is very useful. We can see maybe that we really need to focus on staying on task. That's an area that our school needs to be focused on, and we can really focus our efforts into maybe teaching more expectations about staying on task. Another thing that you can do is award house points. I know some of our schools utilize this and have friendly competitions between some of their grade levels. So you could even kind of use it in that way. So here you can see all the grade levels have this competition. Over on the right-hand side, the Valley View Intermediate 5th grade class, they were winners of the Silver Spoon Award. So they use it in their cafeteria. Bus drivers can use it, and I'll get into more once I talk about tier 2 and tier 3, how you can use those demerits to help drive your decision making as well. Which takes me to tier 2 and tier 3. So this is certainly a little shameless plug for ourselves as your facilitator. So once you would like to start moving towards your advanced tiers, we could come out and do a training for your team. And during your tier 2 and tier 3 meetings, you're really determining those decision roles for identifying those students who need additional supports, those students who are getting more than 3 office discipline referrals, or they're ones that have a lot of suspensions, maybe a lot of minor behaviors. Maybe they're going to the guidance office or the nurse's office a lot. During this time, we're also considering the use of a teacher referral system. So giving space for our teachers to really say, hey, I need help with this student. During this time too, we are also using screeners to determine appropriate function-based interventions of those instructional needs. Maybe it's district-wide, school-wide, but it can also be used to match a student with an appropriate function of behavior. During tier 2 and tier 3, teams are using and reviewing data every other week to monitor student progress. And as always, we're conducting that TFI annually to assess the fidelity of those systems. With tier 2 and tier 3, one model that is brought up a lot for meetings and meeting frameworks is the team initiated problem solving, or what we call TIPS. It is a kind of lengthy, but really good resource used to, identify the problem areas or those students, and really helps to kind of formulate our meetings to make sure that we are looking at the who, what, the when, the where, the why, identifying a goal, and then identifying those solutions. Again, at the end of this presentation, we have a link to several different of those forms that you can copy or reuse, but we are also able to come out and do a training for tips as well. With all of this, when we are implementing tier 2 and tier 3 and we're coming up with, interventions to develop during this time and send out, it's so important for our students to and our staff to know how students become eligible for an intervention, how progress is monitored, and how students exit the intervention, which takes us to an intervention grid. And we complete these during our tier 2 and tier 3 meetings. In each intervention that we roll out, we have a description, that entry criteria, ways to progress monitor, and that exit criteria, which allows these interventions to be done effectively. But it also ensures that our students are not in what we call intervention jail, right? We don't want these kids to be stuck on an intervention for years and years and years without any data to back up whether or not they need a new intervention or not. Another thing that we would consider using is a screener. And again, this can be done with all of our students, but one in particular that we use a lot is the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. This is the SDQ, and we use this to match those tier 2, those identified students, to appropriate interventions based on the function of behavior. So with the questions that are given to the staff members to evaluate some of these problem behaviors, it'll then give us a cut score that would put in and identify a student for emotional symptoms, conduct problems, hyperactivity, inattention, peer relation problems, and pro-social behavior. So on the next slide, we have a sort of, and yes, it's important to really, have all of this, but, oh, that's okay. Sorry. With this, advanced tiers, we always have to have those interventions in place before we ever do screen, because when you screen, you have to intervene. And a lot of schools get very nervous about that, but we make sure that you have appropriate interventions in place before ever rolling out a screening. With that, this right here is a wonderful, model of how that SDQ is implemented. And you can see those categories that I mentioned at the top and specific interventions that lie underneath each of those. So that way, when you have a student who's referred, you pick that intervention, you've got something underneath for that student to kind of be involved in. Couple more things to wrap this up. Just wanted to note too, with those demerits, you can see, you can do that with specific students. And on the next slide here, they use those demerits to determine and qualify those students for tier 2 support. So you can see, you can filter those demerits, and, again, these are your classroom managed behaviors, and maybe those students are the ones that we were talking about at our tier 2 meetings. This, of course, is something that is, has a price on it. But if you see here, we included resources that relate to all of the things that we talked about. I know this is only 30 minutes, but if you want more information on anything, there's the live school link, takes you to pricing. We have ci3t.org, which has our screening tools, all of our screeners here, and then also those tips meeting formats. The top link will take you to our professional development request form. And here you can request us to come out and really talk to you guys about really anything and everything, and your staff members related to PBIS and behavior. So please take advantage of that. Those trainings are almost all free, and we're happy to come support you guys in any way possible. Just a reminder too, this will be recorded and shared to our Padlet that is in the chat here, and we will now stop recording.